Aaliyah was a bright and talented 16-year-old who had always loved expressing herself through art. For weeks, she had been preparing for a big day. Her painting was selected to be displayed at an art showcase. It was the first time her work would be shown in public, and she couldn't contain her excitement. She woke up early, carefully dressed in a simple but neat outfit, and packed her portfolio. Her heart was racing with anticipation, imagining the crowd admiring her work. On her way to the event, Aaliyah decided to stop at a small corner store to grab a bottle of water. It was a warm day, and she wanted to stay refreshed before the big moment. The store was quiet, with a few people browsing. Aaliyah walked in, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and made her way to the counter to pay. As she reached into her bag to pull out some cash, a voice called out behind her. "What are you doing here?" Startled, Aaliyah turned around to see a police officer standing near the entrance. His uniform was sharp, but his face was stern, and his eyes looked at her as if she had done something wrong. Confused, Aaliyah replied, "I'm just buying water." The officer, who introduced himself as Harris, stepped closer, narrowing his eyes. "You're hanging around here like you're up to something. What's in that bag?" he asked, pointing at her portfolio. Aaliyah blinked, unsure why she was being questioned. "It's just my artwork," she explained, holding the portfolio up. "I'm going to an art showcase. My painting is being displayed today." But Harris didn't seem to believe her. Instead, he crossed his arms and said, "Really? You expect me to believe that? Kids like you don't usually hang around here unless they're causing trouble." The words stung. Aaliyah could feel her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She looked around and saw a couple of customers staring at the interaction, their faces filled with curiosity, but no signs of intervention. Harris's tone grew sharper as he began accusing her of loitering, suggesting she might be planning to steal something. Aaliyah's heart sank. She tried to explain herself, showing her portfolio and even pointing to her event pass. But Harris waved it off, saying, "That doesn't prove anything." His loud voice made it feel like everyone in the store was watching her, and she felt small under the weight of his assumptions. She wanted to leave and get to her event, but Harris blocked her path. "Not so fast," he said. "Where's your ID? You don't just walk around without ID. That's suspicious." Aaliyah froze. She hadn't brought her school ID because she didn't think she'd need it. All she had was her phone and her event pass. "I don't have it with me," she said softly, her voice trembling. Harris shook his head as if he had caught her in a lie. "Well, then we might have a problem," he said. Aaliyah felt trapped. The pride she had felt just hours earlier had been replaced with anxiety and humiliation. But deep down, she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. Clutching her phone tightly, she discreetly sent a text to her father, hoping he could help her. The atmosphere in the small store grew heavy as Aaliyah stood there, unsure of what to do. Her hands tightened around her portfolio, the one thing that symbolized all her hard work and dreams. But in that moment, it didn't seem to matter. The officer wasn't interested in hearing her side of the story. Instead, his tone became sharper, almost like he wanted her to slip up. "I've seen this before," Officer Harris said, shaking his head. "Young people thinking they can get away with anything. If you're innocent, why don't you have ID on you? Seems pretty convenient." Aaliyah felt a lump form in her throat. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, being accused as if she had committed a crime. "I told you," she said softly, trying to stay calm. "I didn't think I'd need it. I'm just going to my art event." But Harris wasn't listening. He started questioning her about where she lived, what she was doing in that area, and why she thought she could just walk into a store without raising suspicion. His words were cutting, each one making Aaliyah feel smaller. She could see the people in the store watching, their eyes bouncing between her and the officer. Some looked uncomfortable, but no one stepped in to help. The cashier, an older man, glanced at her with a hint of sympathy but said nothing. It was as if everyone had decided it wasn't their place to get involved. Alia's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down quickly and saw a reply from her father. "I'm on my way," the text read. Relief washed over her for a brief moment, but she was still stuck there, face to face with an officer who seemed determined to make her feel guilty for something she hadn't done. Harris leaned closer, lowering his voice but keeping it sharp. "Listen, if you don't cooperate, I'll have no choice but to take you down to the station. Is that what you want?" The idea of being taken to a police station terrified Aaliyah. Her mind raced with thoughts of missing her showcase, of her teachers and friends wondering why she didn't show up, of her dreams being overshadowed by this humiliating encounter. But she refused to let tears fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the panic she felt inside. Harris smirked as if he found her defiance amusing. "We'll see about that," he said, stepping back but keeping a close eye on her. Minutes felt like hours as she stood there, clutching her belongings and silently praying for her father to arrive quickly. She glanced at the door, hoping to see a familiar face, but it remained closed. The officer began pacing, his eyes darting toward the growing crowd outside. Someone had started filming with their phone, and it was clear Harris noticed. The tension in the air was thick, and Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling of being judged not just by the officer, but by everyone around her. She kept reminding herself that her father would come soon, and when he did, everything would be okay. At least, she hoped it would. As Aaliyah stood in the store, trying to remain calm, she couldn't help but feel trapped. The officer's words were sharp, and his tone carried an authority that made her feel powerless. She clutched her portfolio tighter, hoping it would shield her from the judgment she felt all around her. The longer the situation dragged on, the more the uneasiness grew. "Don't try to act smart," Officer Harris said, his voice louder now. He was pacing near the entrance, occasionally glancing at the small crowd gathering outside. People stood with their phones out, recording every word and movement. Aaliyah felt her cheeks flush, not from guilt, but from the sheer embarrassment of being the center of this unwanted attention. "I told you, I'm going to my art showcase," she repeated, her voice steady but soft. "You can even call the event organizers to check." Harris scoffed, shaking his head as if her words didn't matter. "And how do I know you're not just making all this up? You don't have ID, you're hanging around here like you own the place. And now you expect me to believe some wild story about an art event." His words dripped with disbelief, and the smirk on his face made Alia's stomach churn. She glanced at the door again, silently praying that her father would show up soon. Every second felt like an eternity. Her phone buzzed again in her hand, and she quickly glanced at the screen. It was another message from her dad. "Almost there. Stay strong." Aaliyah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Her father's words gave her a glimmer of hope, but she still felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had always been taught to stay respectful, to speak calmly, and to avoid escalating situations, but it was hard to keep those lessons in mind when she felt so unfairly treated. Outside the store, the crowd had grown. People whispered among themselves, some looking angry at what they were witnessing, while others seemed more curious than concerned. A middle-aged woman with a shopping bag walked up to the door, but hesitated before entering, her eyes darting between Aaliyah and Harris. She stood there for a moment before stepping back, deciding it wasn't worth getting involved. "Is this really necessary?" a voice finally said from the back of the store. A man who had been browsing the snack aisle spoke up, his tone cautious but firm. "She's just a kid. She hasn't done anything." Harris turned sharply, glaring at the man. "Mind your own business," he snapped. The man shrugged and stepped back, muttering under his breath. Aaliyah appreciated the small show of support, but it didn't change much. Harris seemed determined to prove that she was in the wrong. He crossed his arms and looked down at her, his posture towering and intimidating. "If you've got nothing to hide, You won't mind waiting for me to confirm things, he said smugly. Aaliyah stayed quiet, knowing there was no point in arguing further. All she could do was wait. The thought of her father pulling up any second kept her grounded. She knew he would handle this. Her father was her rock, the person she trusted most to protect her and make things right. The sound of a car engine outside caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat. Finally, help was here. The faint rumble of an engine outside made Aliyah's heart leap with relief. She turned her head toward the door, hoping it was her father. Moments later, the door to the store opened, and there he was, her dad, dressed in his firefighter uniform, looking as calm and composed as ever. His broad shoulders seemed to fill the small space as he stepped inside, and his presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Jerome, her father, had a way of commanding attention without even trying. His steady gaze moved from Aaliyah to Officer Harris, taking in the scene. He didn't rush or raise his voice. Instead, he approached Aaliyah with a reassuring smile. "You okay, sweetheart?" he asked softly, his voice full of calm strength. Aaliyah nodded, though her eyes betrayed the stress she had been feeling. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't do anything. He thinks I'm lying." Jerome placed a comforting hand on her shoulder before turning to Harris. "I'm her father," he said simply. His tone was firm but respectful. "What seems to be the problem here?" Harris looked Jerome up and down, his face tightening as if he didn't appreciate being questioned. "She was acting suspicious," he said. "No ID, hanging around in the store, and her story about an art showcase doesn't add up. I was just doing my job." Jerome raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but questioning. "Acting suspicious, by buying a bottle of water." His voice remained steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to his words. "And since when is not carrying ID a crime?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing his reasoning didn't sound as solid under scrutiny. "I have to check out every situation," he said defensively. "You can never be too careful." Jerome nodded slowly, as if considering Harris's words. Then he spoke with quiet authority. "I understand you have a job to do, officer. But that doesn't give you the right to assume the worst about my daughter without any real reason. She told you why she's here. She showed you her portfolio. What more does she need to prove to you that she's not causing trouble?" By now, the small crowd outside the store had grown, and many of them were watching the exchange through the windows. A couple of people even nodded in agreement with Jerome's words. The quiet murmurs of support made Harris glance nervously at the onlookers. Jerome continued, his voice unwavering. "My daughter is on her way to an art event, one she's worked hard for. Instead of encouraging a young person pursuing her dreams, you've humiliated her in front of strangers. Is that really the kind of example you want to set?" Harris's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He seemed unsure of how to handle Jerome's calm yet pointed approach. Aaliyah watched her father, feeling a mix of pride and gratitude. He hadn't raised his voice or made a scene, but his words carried more weight than anything she could have said. For the first time since the encounter began, she felt a sense of hope that things might turn around. Jerome then looked at Aaliyah and smiled gently. "You're doing great," he said quietly. Then, turning back to Harris, he added, "Now, if you have any real reason to keep us here, say so. Otherwise, my daughter has a place to be." The silence in the store was deafening. All eyes were on Harris, waiting to see what he would do next. The tension in the store was thick. Jerome stood tall, his calm yet firm demeanor making everyone, including Officer Harris, take notice. Aaliyah felt a wave of relief, but she was still anxious. Her father's presence gave her strength, but she wasn't sure how this would end. Harris glanced around, clearly aware that the growing crowd outside was watching his every move. Some of them had their phones out, recording. The pressure was building, and he seemed to realize that this situation was quickly slipping out of his control. She needs ID, Harris said, his voice a little less confident now. It's standard procedure. Jerome tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but questioning. Standard procedure, he repeated. Is that the procedure for everyone, or just for kids like my daughter? His tone wasn't accusing, but it carried enough weight to make Harris shift uncomfortably. Jerome took a step closer, keeping his voice steady. Let me explain something to you, he said, looking directly at Harris. My daughter doesn't need to prove her innocence just because you decided she's suspicious. She's told you why she's here. She showed you her portfolio. She's done nothing wrong. So why is she still standing here, feeling like a criminal? A few murmurs of agreement came from outside. The crowd was growing louder, and Harris seemed to feel the pressure mounting. He looked down at Aaliyah's portfolio, then back at Jerome. I'm just trying to do my job, he said defensively. And I respect that, Jerome replied, nodding slightly. But doing your job doesn't mean you get to assume the worst about someone without cause. My daughter is a hard-working, talented young woman. She's not a threat. She's not a problem. She's just a kid trying to get to her art event. Aaliyah watched as her father spoke. His words were strong, but his voice remained steady. He didn't yell or lose his temper, even though she could tell he was upset. She admired how he could stand up for her without losing control, how he could turn the situation around just by speaking the truth. Harris looked like he wanted to say something, but he hesitated. His gaze flicked to the crowd outside, then back to Jerome. It was clear that he was beginning to realize he had misjudged the situation. At that moment, the door to the store opened again. A senior officer, alerted by the commotion, stepped inside. He was an older man with a calm but commanding presence. He looked around, taking in the scene, the nervous expression on Harris's face, Jerome standing protectively by his daughter, and the growing crowd outside. What's going on here? The senior officer asked, his voice firm but neutral. Jerome stepped forward slightly, explaining the situation clearly and calmly. He described how Aaliyah had been stopped without cause and how Harris's assumptions had escalated things unnecessarily. The senior officer listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Jerome finished, the officer turned to Harris. Is that true? He asked. Harris hesitated, glancing nervously at the senior officer. I was just trying to be thorough, he said weakly. The senior officer's gaze hardened. Being thorough doesn't mean making baseless accusations, he said. We don't treat people this way. Aaliyah felt her chest loosen for the first time since the encounter began. Finally, someone was holding Harris accountable. Jerome placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, silently letting her know that everything was going to be okay. The senior officer's words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was almost deafening. Officer Harris shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiff as if trying to maintain authority that was quickly slipping away. Aaliyah stood quietly by her father, her heart still pounding, though a flicker of relief was beginning to take hold. Jerome, ever composed, spoke up again. Thank you for stepping in, he said to the senior officer, his tone respectful but firm. My daughter's been through enough. She doesn't deserve to feel humiliated for simply existing and trying to follow her dreams. The senior officer nodded, his gaze serious. He turned to Aaliyah and said, Young lady, I'm sorry for any distress this situation has caused you. It sounds like you've worked hard to get where you are, and I commend you for that. Aaliyah nodded slowly, still processing everything. The kind words were a stark contrast to how she had been spoken to just moments ago. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice soft but sincere. The officer then shifted his attention back to Harris, his expression firm. Let's step outside for a moment, he said. It wasn't a request. It was a directive. Harris, clearly uncomfortable but unable to argue, followed him out of the store. The tension eased slightly as they left, but Aaliyah still felt the weight in her chest. Jerome crouched slightly so he could look her in the eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now. Aaliyah nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "I just don't understand why he didn't believe me," she said quietly. Jerome sighed, a mix of frustration and sadness in his eyes. "Sometimes people let their own biases cloud their judgment," he explained. "It's not fair, and it's not right. But you handled yourself with grace, and I'm proud of you for that." His words brought a small but genuine smile to her face. It wasn't easy to find strength in such moments, but her father's support gave her the courage she needed. As they prepared to leave, one of the bystanders who had been watching the scene from outside stepped into the store. It was a woman with a warm smile and a kind demeanor. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice gentle, "you're incredibly brave. I saw everything, and I'm sorry you had to go through that. Keep your head up, okay?" Aaliyah smiled shyly, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you." The small gesture of kindness meant more to her than she could express. Jerome thanked the woman as well before guiding Aaliyah toward the door. The crowd outside had started to disperse, though a few people lingered, still talking about what had happened. As they stepped out into the sunlight, the weight on Aaliyah's shoulders began to lift. She glanced at her father. "Do you think this will affect my art event?" she asked nervously. Jerome shook his head with a reassuring smile. "Not at all," he said. "We're going to get you there, and you're going to shine like I know you will." Aaliyah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The thought of the showcase reignited the excitement she had felt earlier that morning. Her father's confidence in her was contagious, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she felt hopeful again. As they walked toward the car, Aaliyah looked up at her dad. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said sincerely. Jerome wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Always," he said simply. "You're my daughter, and I'll always have your back." The simple yet powerful promise stayed with her as they drove off, leaving the chaos of the store behind. As they drove away from the store, Aaliyah sat quietly, staring out the window. The events of the morning played over and over in her mind, each moment leaving a deeper impression. She could still feel the heat of the officer's harsh gaze and hear the sharpness in his tone. Yet, alongside those unpleasant memories was the steady, reassuring presence of her father. Jerome glanced over at her, sensing the heaviness in her silence. "You're awfully quiet," he said gently. "What's on your mind?" Aaliyah hesitated, unsure how to put her feelings into words. "It's just," she began, trailing off. She shifted in her seat, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her bag. "Why do people think they can treat us like that? Like we're less than them?" Jerome took a deep breath, his grip on the steering wheel tightening slightly. "It's a tough question," he admitted, his tone thoughtful. "Some people carry biases they don't even realize. Others let fear or ignorance guide their actions. But none of that excuses what happened today. It's not right, and it's not fair." Aaliyah nodded slowly, her father's words settling in her mind. "It just felt so humiliating," she said, her voice quieter now. "Like no matter what I said, he had already decided I was guilty of something." Jerome's heart ached hearing the pain in her voice. "You know, sometimes people will judge you before they even know who you are," he said. "But their judgment doesn't define you. How you handle those moments, that's what truly matters. And you handled yourself with strength and grace today. I couldn't be prouder." Aaliyah looked over at him, her eyes touching his face. "You think so?" "I know so," Jerome said with a smile. "You kept your cool. You didn't let his words break you. And most importantly, you stayed true to yourself. That takes courage, more than most people realize." His words began to ease the tightness in her chest. She leaned back in her seat, allowing herself to exhale deeply for what felt like the first time all morning. As they approached the venue for her art showcase, the nervous energy that had been brewing inside her since the incident at the store began to shift. Instead of feeling small and uncertain, She started to feel a sense of determination. She wasn't going to let what happened define her day. Jerome parked the car and turned to her. "This is your moment, kiddo," he said, his eyes full of pride. "You've worked hard for this. Don't let anyone or anything take that away from you." Aaliyah nodded, a small but confident smile spreading across her face. She grabbed her portfolio, clutching it tightly as she stepped out of the car. The building loomed in front of her, its sleek glass doors reflecting the sunlight. Inside, she could already see people milling about, some chatting excitedly, while others admired the artwork displayed on the walls. As they walked toward the entrance, Jerome put a hand on her shoulder. "Remember," he said softly, "you belong here. You've earned this." Those words were all she needed to hear. Aaliyah straightened her posture, taking a deep breath as she pushed the door open. The sounds of laughter and conversation filled the air, and the sight of vibrant art lining the walls immediately lifted her spirits. This was her world, her passion, and her chance to show what she was capable of. Whatever had happened earlier that day felt distant now, as though it belonged to another time. Aaliyah was ready to take her place in the spotlight. Aaliyah stepped into the venue, her heart thudding against her chest. The space was alive with energy, brightly lit with natural sunlight pouring through the tall windows. People moved between art displays, chatting and admiring the work. The room buzzed with excitement, and for a moment she hesitated, clutching her portfolio tightly. Jerome walked beside her, his hand lightly on her shoulder as if to anchor her. "You've got this," he whispered, his voice calm and steady. "This is your moment. Go show them who you are." Aaliyah nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She scanned the room, looking for the section where her art was supposed to be displayed. A friendly-looking organizer caught her eye and walked over. "Hi there. You must be one of our featured young artists," the organizer said warmly. "Can I help you get set up?" "Yes," Aaliyah said, her voice a little shaky but growing stronger. She introduced herself and handed over her portfolio, watching as the organizer flipped through her work. "Wow," the organizer said, stopping to admire one of her pieces. "Your work is incredible. I can see why you were chosen for this event." Aaliyah felt a blush creep across her cheeks. "Thank you," she said softly, her confidence starting to build. The organizer led her to a table where her artwork would be displayed. As they carefully arranged her pieces, Jerome stood nearby, watching with pride. He could see the shift in his daughter's demeanor, the way her shoulders straightened, the way her eyes lit up as she saw her work take its place among the other talented artists. As the event officially began, more people started to gather around Aaliyah's display. At first, she felt nervous, unsure how to respond to the compliments and questions. But as she heard people talk about her work, how it moved them, how they interpreted her unique style, her nerves slowly melted away. A middle-aged couple stopped to admire one of her paintings, a vibrant depiction of a city street at night. "This is stunning," the woman said, her eyes scanning every detail. "The way you've captured the light and movement. It's almost alive." Aaliyah smiled shyly. "Thank you. That one was inspired by a late-night walk I took downtown. I wanted to show how the city feels when it's both busy and quiet at the same time." The couple nodded, clearly impressed. "You've done an amazing job," the man said. "Keep going. You have real talent." As more people stopped by, Aaliyah began to find her rhythm. She answered questions about her inspiration, her techniques, and her creative process. Each interaction left her feeling more confident and validated. Jerome stayed in the background, letting his daughter shine, but ready to step in if she needed him. He watched as she began to laugh and engage with the crowd, her initial shyness giving way to excitement. This was her space, her passion, and she was owning it. One of the event coordinators approached her toward the end of the evening, a beaming smile on her face. "We're so impressed with your work," she said. "The judges were particularly drawn to your piece with the city lights. It's truly exceptional." Aaliyah's eyes widened. Judges? She asked, surprised. The coordinator nodded. Yes, we've been selecting pieces to be highlighted in an upcoming gallery. And yours is one of the top choices. Aaliyah felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. Really? She whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and excitement. Absolutely, the coordinator said. We'll be in touch with the details soon. Congratulations. Jerome walked over just in time to hear the news. What did I tell you? He said with a wide smile. You were meant for this. Aaliyah grinned, her heart soaring. The doubts and struggles of earlier that day seemed like a distant memory now. This moment, this recognition, it was everything she had worked for. The night was winding down, and the event had been a success. People were still gathered around, chatting and admiring the artwork, but Aaliyah had started to feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. Her mind replayed everything that had happened, from the intense confrontation with the officer earlier in the day to the overwhelming kindness and respect she had received at the art show. Jerome stood by her side, watching the crowd slowly disperse. His pride in his daughter was written all over his face. They had come a long way, and tonight was proof that their journey had been worth it. Dad, Aaliyah said, her voice soft but full of emotion. I can't believe it. The judges want my work for the gallery. I never thought something like this could happen. Jerome smiled, his eyes softening as he looked at her. I always knew it would. You've got something special, Aaliyah. It's not just your talent, it's your heart. That's what makes your art stand out. She felt a warmth spread through her chest as her father's words sank in. It wasn't just about the recognition or the success. It was about knowing that she had stayed true to herself, despite everything that had happened. As they left the venue, Aaliyah couldn't help but glance around one more time, taking in the vibrant atmosphere, the smiles of those who had seen her work. She had come here as a nervous artist, unsure of what to expect. But now, she was leaving with her head held high, her confidence stronger than it had ever been. Do you think this is just the beginning? Aaliyah asked as they walked to the car. Her voice was filled with curiosity and excitement, wondering what the future might hold. Jerome unlocked the car and smiled at her. Of course, it's just the beginning. You've got the world in front of you. What you do next is up to you. Keep pushing, keep creating, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself. As they drove home, Aaliyah reflected on the day. The humiliation and the challenge she had faced earlier with the officer felt like they belonged to a different world now. It had been a tough moment, one that had tested her patience and resilience. But it had also been a defining moment. It had taught her that no matter what others believed or how they treated her, she had the strength to stand her ground. Jerome's voice broke through her thoughts as he turned the radio down. You know that officer, he's probably going to think twice before he judges someone again, he said with a chuckle. Aaliyah smiled at the thought. I hope so. But honestly, I'm just glad it didn't take away from tonight. Her father nodded. You didn't let it. That's the key. No one can take away what's inside you. You've already proven that. As they drove into their neighborhood, the familiar streets filled Aaliyah with a sense of peace. She had faced challenges, but she had also found her own strength. The future was wide open now, full of possibilities, and Aaliyah knew she was ready for whatever came next. When they pulled up to the house, Aaliyah took one last look at the car window, smiling to herself. She was no longer just a quiet girl with a dream. She was a young artist with a bright future, and nothing could take that away.